Hello friends, shall I tell you a story? There was a king and a queen, both of them died. The end. If one has to summarize the French Revolution in one line, this is the only way. But obviously, this story is quite complex, full of twists and turns, but it is an important story. The French Revolution is considered to be one of the most important revolutions in the history because after this revolution, democracy began to spread throughout the world. This was the origin of phrases such as left wing and right wing. In this video, let's understand the French Revolution.
French history has been marked by several violent and bloody revolutions.
French Revolution is this extraordinary moment when people began to believe that you could actually recreate almost everything in a society.
And a new republic would be born in blood. The blood of the French Revolution.
French history has been marred by several violent and bloody revolutions. Revolution is an extraordinary moment when people begin to believe that you can actually recreate almost everything in society. And a new republic would be born in blood, the blood of the French Revolution. Let's start our story from the 17th century, the 1600s. What did the world look like then? The world has ruled by kings and emperors, and these kings and emperors loved fighting each other to see who could have the biggest empire, who could become the most powerful. That's why you can see so many wars all around the world. In Europe, the 30 Years' War was underway, the Congo War in Africa, the Ming King War in China, the Mughal Maratha War in India. But how did the common people fare in the midst of these wars? For the common people all around the world, there was a strict social hierarchy in the society. The class distinction was severe between the social classes. The classes were broadly divided into three parts. On the top were the rulers and their families and advisors. We can call them the aristocracy and nobility. Then were the clergy, the bishops or priests or the ulema. The clergy were named differently based on the region and country. And the third class was of the common people, the peasants, the farmers. I address the third section as farmers mainly, because then most people were employed in the agriculture sector. This social hierarchy is quite similar to the caste system in India. It begs the question, was this going on for years? People had accepted this system for thousands of years. Did they have no problem with it? Why were they tolerating this discrimination? The one word answer to this would be religion. Most of the people believed that the rulers were chosen by God to rule, known as the doctrine of divine right of kings, that the kings are selected by God, and that's why there should be no accountability of a king. And the clergies of all religions claimed that they were chosen by God to be the guardians of spirituality and religion. So what about the peasants and the lowest of all? They accepted their suffering as decreed by God. The circumstances of their birth, they believed it was because of their sins on their past lives. I'm just broadly classifying things. The reasoning differed a little in each country and religion. There were various specific reasons, but these were the basic excuses. During the 1600s, a new intellectual movement began in Europe. People started using their brains. People asked themselves, should the existing system continue? Who gave the right to the ruler to rule? This era is known as the Age of Enlightenment. Using one's brain, René Descartes was a French philosopher and mathematician known as the father of modern philosophy. One of his most famous statements was, "The reason for my existence in my ability to think for myself." These became the foundation of the Age of Enlightenment. The Bible contained that the sun revolves around the earth, but Galileo observed Jupiter with his telescope and saw Jupiter's moons revolving around the Jupiter. With this, he came up with his scientific theory, contrary to the widely held notion. He claimed that the earth revolves around the sun. This infuriated the guardians of the religion. They berated him for questioning the Bible. They sentenced Galileo to life imprisonment. But Galileo wasn't the only one. Isaac Newton then published the three laws of motion. Many such scientists came forward with scientific explanation for the things that happen all around us. Every so often, a guy would claim himself to be the Messiah or the reincarnation of God and would hold out a religious scripture, and you would have to believe that what's written on it. It couldn't be questioned, but people started questioning them. It became quite difficult to justify religion, and so a new ideology came up known as deism, started by writer Edward Herbert in England. He said that the things written in the scriptures can be questioned. He claimed that miracles and prophecies don't exist. They're baseless. He said that even if God had created the world, he has stopped interfering with the world. And if people want to reach God, they need to use reason. They need to use their brains. This ideology challenged the authority of the church. He asked how any person, any clergy can direct how they need to live their lives. John Locke opposed the doctrine of divine right of kings and said that everyone is equal. No person has the right to rule over the others. And if someone is given the power to govern, they should take permission from the people first. This was the original idea of democracy. The purpose of the government should be to protect the natural right of the citizens, and if a government cannot do so, the people should have the right to overthrow the government. Montesquieu, Thomas Hobbes, and Rousseau were some other philosophers who promoted similar ideas. Rousseau's famous quote says, "The man is born free and everywhere is in the chains. Though man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. Why so? Every citizen should have liberty. But what is liberty? Liberty basically means the freedom to do as one wishes as long as one doesn't harm someone else. And everyone should be guaranteed this freedom equally by the law." Everything told you till now, these were the fundamental ideologies of the time on which the French Revolution was based. Now let's talk about what had actually happened. At the time in France, the hierarchy that I told you about, the same hierarchy existed in France too. Nobility, clergy, and peasantry. The clergy, the people of the religion, imposed a religious tax on the common people. It was one tenth of any agriculture produce. Whatever money a farmer earned from his produce, he had to pay one tenth of it to the clergy as religious tax. In addition to this, nobility had also imposed a direct land tax on the commoners, known as tally. But the nobility and the clergy paid negligible taxes then. The common people shouldered most of the taxes. The farmers, they had to pay heavy taxes. The paintings of the time describe the situation, showing how the nobility and clergy were riding on the backs of peasants. In total, the nobility and clergy in France were about 2% of the population then, while the other 98% were made of peasants and farmers. At the time, the three categories were known as the three estates. Talking about the 1750s to 1760s, the economy of France was struggling. France could frequently go on a war against Britain because both were colonial powers. So there were many conflicts and wars between the two. And in the 7-Year War from 1756 to 1763, France was almost bankrupt. It was under large debts. During this time in 1774, King Louis was appointed the new king. He was 20 years old when he became the king. Famines were quite common then, so the crops grown by farmers were closely monitored by the government, so that if any area in France was faced with a famine, then the other areas that had a surplus of grains, a good amount of agriculture produce, they could import the grains from there to avoid famine. They had grain police for this, to supervise and ensure that it was done properly. And if someone was hoarding grains, they were strictly punished. When Louis became king, he made Robert Jacques Turgot his finance minister, a close friend of Adam Smith. His ideology was basically that government shouldn't interfere in anything at all. Jacques Turgot applied the same ideology in France then. In September 1774, Turgot passed new farm laws. Think of them as the Black Farm Laws because these laws stopped the government's interference. The grain merchants could buy the crops, they could hold the crops and sell them later at artificially inflated prices. This led to grain prices increasing rapidly. Food became very expensive. There was unprecedented inflation, and as a result, in April-May 1975, people started rioting, called the Floor War, riots over the floor. Turgot's intention wasn't wrong. He sincerely believed that without the government's interference, people would benefit from it. But when he saw that this wasn't successful, Turgot proposed to levy taxes on the nobility and clergy as well, so that they could improve the financial position of their country. But why would the people in the power, the nobility and clergy, allow this? Turgot was removed from the post of finance minister in 1776. Interestingly, 1776 was the year when America became an independent country, the revolutionaries and freedom fighters of America. Do you know who supported them to get independent? Francis King Louis. The simple reason behind it, since America was a British colony and France and Britain were enemies then, France helped America become independent because it would mean that Britain would have to surrender the area. Doing so was expensive for France. This was followed by another war between France and Britain, the Anglo-French War 1778 to 1783. The debt on France increased further to 2 billion livres. Imagine the situation. People were living in poverty while the King of France built a massive palace for himself. How could the people react? King Louis did this and spent a lot of money on it. A huge amount was spent on the palace in Versailles for maintenance and King Louis' debauchery. Interestingly enough, King Louis wasn't the only one in his family to do so. His wife Marie Antoinette was a bigger libertine. If you make a list of libertines that ever existed, Marie Antoinette would be at the top of the list always. Wife of Louis. It is said that she was so profligate. Every year, she would order 300 new outfits. She undertook the landscaping the gardens outside the palace. You can see them in Versailles. It's only 20 kilometers from Paris. She created expensive perfumes for herself, some exclusive fragrances for herself, and perhaps the most extraordinary of all was her hairstyle. She had literally put a boat on her head as a hairstyle. Can you imagine it? There's a painting of it too. Those celebrities don't wear outfits nowadays. But to have a boat on one side, such a hairstyle is unthinkable even now. Mary had several love affairs too. She used to send love letters to a Swedish nobleman Axel Fersen. You'd ask what love affairs have to do with a revolution. As I told you guys, people used to think that rulers were sent by God. The divine right of kings theory that I talked about, people considered the king and queen to be sent by God. So when they saw their queen having love affairs outside her marriage, people were certain that she wasn't sent by God. So the people had many reasons to hate King Louis. There was a lot of hatred among the people. There was no end to these problems. When people are so infuriated, it can lead to riots and civil wars. But if this anger could be given a direction, then anger can be turned into a revolution. The Age of Enlightenment was the source of direction for this anger. As I told you at the beginning of this video, the philosophers, newspaper, and books of the time were talking about these, how the rulers weren't deserving, how there should be equality among people. Even the illiterate were listening to these ideas. They started thinking and reasoning too. There were many slogans related to this. One of the most famous slogans of time was, "This is still the motto of France." King Louis tried to appease the people. He wanted to do something to calm down the masses. His new fiancé, Minister Charles Alexander de Coulon, was consulted. His suggestions were akin to Turgot's. He said that if they intend to improve the financial situation of the country, they would need to impose a new tax on the clergy and nobility. But the nobility and clergy could not let this happen. Charles lost his job too. The king continued trying to think of a solution. He summoned the state generals. The state generals was like a government of the time. Although there were not governments like we know them, they were a body of people who worked as a government and acted as advisors to the king. The actual decision-making power was with the king alone. This advisory body could merely advise the king. But the most interesting thing about the estate generals was that it had representatives from all three estates. Another interesting fact that the estate generals weren't summoned in the preceding 175 years. 1614 was the last time they were summoned. King Louis summoned them again on 5th May 1789. Why did he do so? Because the nobility and clergy weren't allowing the financial advisors' advice to be implemented. They were creating a ruckus in the parliament in Paris. That's why Louis thought to use the estate generals as rubber stamps. Each of the three estates had a single vote. The clergy had one vote, the nobility had one vote, and one vote to the rest of the 98% of the population. Three votes in total, and whenever they had to make a decision, it would be 2:1. The clergy and nobility joined hands to vote against the people, so they couldn't reach a favorable decision. Frustrated by this, the commoners then wanted one vote to each individual member instead of one vote to a group. They wanted one vote for each individual. The king didn't take this demand seriously. So the members of the third estate, the representatives of the commoners, didn't want to remain a part of the estate general. They decided to form their own estate general, their government wherein every person would get equal votes. When King Louis found out about this, he locked the hall so that commoners couldn't enter the hall. He wanted to prevent them from forming a government by locking the hall. So the commoners went to a tennis court nearby. It was an empty lot. On this tennis court, they took the famous tennis court oath. They declared their independent government on 17 June. It is known as the Declaration of National Assembly. They said that they wouldn't be stopped from creating a new constitution for France. They wanted to write a constitution which would provide equal treatment for all, so that there would be a true quality in country. The liberals from the nobility and clergy became a part of this nation assembly. King Louis was shocked to see this. He saw that he couldn't prevent them from forming a new government. He feared that they would soon overthrow him. They might even kill him. So on 27th June, King Louis acknowledged this National Assembly. He agreed to the National Assembly forming the new government when people were seated in the National Assembly's hall. The people on the left were from the Third Estate, the commoners who support the revolution. They represented 98% of the population. They were seated in the left wing of the National Assembly. On the other side, on the right wing, were the representatives of the clergy and nobility who supported the monarchy. As you would have guessed by now, the two commonly used phrases when discussing politics, left wing and right wing. This was the origin of both phrases. The fundamental ideology of the left wing are liberty, equality, and fraternity. On the other hand, the ideology of the right wing was a reaction to the ideologies of the left wing. You can think of it as the counter revolution. They weren't actually based on principles, but the ideas they practiced can be categorized as traditionalism and conservatism. The traditions passed down from generations, they wanted them to continue. This was the fundamental ideology of the right wing from the perspective of the French Revolution. Our rulers and monarchy, they wanted to uphold them. That was their ideology. People in the left wing demanded equality so that people could be treated the same in society. Without any hierarchies, the people on the right wing used religion and traditions, saying that God has decreed the king to rule, and so he should. They wanted to continue the tradition because it was a tradition. We can still see this ideology at so many places nowadays. Many people from the right wing take this to the extreme. When they are asked about the discrimination between men and women, discrimination between castes, discrimination between races, their reply is often that it is the tradition. Since the tradition has been carried down for ages, it would be continued forever. In the French National Assembly, 98% of the people were supporting the left wing. The right wing had the support of the king, 2% of the people, and the security forces that King Louis was planning on attacking Paris to overthrow the National Assembly. This rumor turned the people violent. There were riots. They attacked the Bastille fort on 14 July. They hoped to find gunpowder and weapons so that they could start a revolution. There, they found 7 prisoners whom they set free, and because of this event on 14 July. Today, the National Day of France is celebrated on 14 July. This was the first spark of the French Revolution. When others got to know about this incident, they started to realize that they too could fight. They wanted the oppression by the clergy and nobility to stop. So when the tax collectors went to the farmers to collect the taxes, they refused to pay any tax. The tax collectors were beaten and thrown out of the fields. Many nobles started fleeing to the European countries. Because France was the only country with the uprising, the other European countries were still content with monarchies. With each day, the power of the National Assembly kept on increasing. The security guards of the king were now paying attention to what the National Assembly was preaching. On 9 July, a National Constituent Assembly was formed from the National Assembly. And on 26 August, this Constituent Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. This document can be seen as the first draft of the French Constitution. This was the first attempt at adopting a constitution. This small document contained 17 articles. This constitution was based on the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. But King Louis refused to sign the document. On 5th October, another spark of revolution ignited. The cost of food, the price of bread hadn't decreased yet. The country was still struggling with high inflation. The economic situation hadn't improved. On 5th October, thousands of women gathered at a market in Paris. They agreed that things had become unbearable. Changes needed to be adopted quickly to improve the economy of the country. For 6 hours, thousands of women walked 13 kilometers to the palace in Versailles. King Louis was on respite there. When these thousands of women walked down to the road, people were motivated by this. Some men and soldiers joined them. This event is called the March of Versailles. After reaching the palace in Versailles, they entered the palace. Seeing these women in the palace, King Louis and his wife Mary were forced to accept their terms. This was when King Louis finally signed the document. After this movement, Women demanded equal rights in the National Assembly. In September 1791, the French activist and feminist Olympe de Gouges published the Declaration of the Right of Women and the Female Citizen, and this was the beginning. Unfortunately, over the next 150 years, women weren't given equal rights in European countries. Elections were called in 1791, and in 1792, the monarchy was completely abolished, and thus France became a republic country. King Louis and Marie Antoinette were imprisoned for their crimes. Later, they were put on trial and sentenced to death. They didn't enforce capital punishment by hanging them. There was the guillotine. A sharp blade would be dropped from a height, and it would cleanly chop off the head. They were the king and queen of the France executed by the revolutionaries. And with this, we come up to the end of the French Revolution, a happy ending. With the end of monarchy in France and France becoming a democratic republic country where everyone was equal and we witnessed complete equality in France. So this was the French Revolution. This is how the French Revolution happened. Thanks for watching this video, and if you liked my content then do subscribe my channel. Thank you so very much.